Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 5 of the Open Online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. This is Andreas, and I'll be answering your questions from the previous week, all the questions you submitted in the forums, and any additional questions you may have, please submit them in the live YouTube chat. As we go through this with your follow-ups, I'll answer come along. In this session, we're talking about Bitcoin in practice. A lot of questions about soft and hard forks and things like that. So let's jump right in. Roberto asks, in page 28 of the reading material about multisig, it mentions a limitation of 15 public keys to sign a transaction. Can you explain how this number came to be the limit? Is there a way to increase it if need be? Roberto, in the current iteration of the consensus rules, there is a 520-byte limit, if I'm not mistaken, on the maximum size of a redeem script. A public key is 32 bytes, and therefore 15 public keys. Public key is a bit bigger than 32 bytes, but a multisig with 15 public keys is the limit of how much you can fit into a redeem script based on the current redeem script size limits. Is there a way to increase it? Yes, there might be ways to increase it. One possible such way is to use Schnorr signatures, in which case I believe you could express the 15 different public keys as a single public key that is the sum. I'm not sure about that, however. And there may be future increases in the limits of a redeem script. These limits have to do with protections against denial of service attacks and the complexity of computation that you can push towards a client. And so, therefore, these might be increased in the future. Question from Roberto was, does the above have to do with the block size limit? Not directly, no. This is a limit on the size of a redeem script for P2SH. Roberto also asks, how many hard forks have there been in the Bitcoin chain so far since Genesis? How can we identify a point of a hard fork when exploring the blockchain? Can we tell by the header of the block? Let's start backwards. Can you tell by the header of the block? No, you can't. And can you identify a point of a hard fork when exploring the blockchain? Only if you have some kind of historical view of blocks that were since orphaned, they're being kept. Otherwise, no, you can't, because during a hard fork, two competing chains emerge, and one of those chains wins. And when that chain wins, the other chain gets dropped, and all of the transactions within it get reorganized. And therefore, once those blocks have been orphaned or already chain, you don't really see them. There's no indication of a hard fork in the blockchain itself. A hard fork occurs when the network disagree about what is the dominant chain, and that disagreement is resolved by the majority of hashing power continuing to build the greatest difficulty chain within a set of consensus rules. So when there's a disagreement about consensus rules, or when there's an implementation bug or something like that. As far as I know, there have been effectively two hard forks in the Bitcoin history. The first one was back in 2010, I believe, which was when there was a bug that allowed someone to mine some billions of Bitcoin in a Coinbase transaction. That bug, which I believe was an overflow bug in the Coinbase transaction, was handled to Satoshi Nakamoto, releasing a new version of the software that basically replaced that block and closed down that bug. Anybody who upgraded to the new version of software released, which was pretty much everybody very, very quickly, would chain up to that point, and then when it encountered that block with the multiple billions of Bitcoins mined in a single block, would see it as invalid. So by fixing the bug, that block is invalid. Therefore, that block and any of its children are no longer part of the valid longest chain. Something that's really important to understand, which is that Bitcoin doesn't select simply the longest chain, but the greatest difficulty chain that is valid based on the consensus rules. In the first implementation, the longest chain, meaning counting how many blocks it had, would win. Satoshi Nakamoto changed that rule, and I think that was also changed in 2010, to calculate the longest difficulty chain, which basically counts the cumulative proof of work that has been applied to a chain and selects the one that represents the greatest amount of work. But both of those metrics, longest or, as it is now, greatest work chain, are within the consensus rules. So it's only the longest or greatest work valid chain that matters. Now, when this bug existed and the block was mined that had an excess of coins in the Coinbase, that bug allowed that block to violate the consensus rules. But as soon as that bug was fixed, when nodes were restarted with the new software fixing that bug, they would look at that block and deem it invalid. Since it was invalid, it could not be processed, and neither could any of the children blocks that were built, meaning that the entire chain from that block forward and miners started building from the offending block's parent and creating a sibling, another child of the parent, that was valid, that had the correct amount in the Coinbase. And that chain very quickly became the greatest work chain. But it didn't win by becoming the greatest work chain. First, it won because it was the only valid chain. The other chain was no longer valid. So a change in the consensus rules can cause a hard fork. Another example we have of a hard fork was, I don't remember the dates exactly, so I'll just go off my top of my head. I think it was April of 2013. It was in the spring of 2013 when Bitcoin Core upgraded from version 0.7 to version 0.8. During that upgrade, the underlying storage mechanism was changed from Berkeley DB to Level DB, which is a Google database. That change caused an unforeseen bug that was found in Berkeley DB. Apparently, until that time, no one had noticed this bug, but Level DB and the upgrade to Level DB caused a fork in the network that revealed this bug. And what happened was, clients that upgraded to the version 0.8 version of Bitcoin Core and were mining on Level DB, blockchain on Level DB, I should say. One of those nodes mined a block with more than 1,024 transactions. When this happened, a bug was uncovered because clients that were still running 0.7 with Berkeley DB were unable to validate that block. There was a limitation in Berkeley DB that allowed only 1,024 file descriptors to be opened in the database. So as the block was validated, the database that was underneath version 0.7 clients attempted to open more than 1,024 file descriptors for the database. And that caused the database engine to crash, which caused the block validation to stop abruptly and caused the Bitcoin nodes to crash. So 0.7 nodes, when they arrived at the point in the blockchain where they found this block that had more than 1,024 transactions, crashed. And when they restarted, they would resync to the same point, try to validate the same block, and crash again. And this repeated. Meanwhile, the clients that were on the 0.8 version of Core continued to build an alternative chain that reached 26 blocks further in length than the chain that 0.7 was able to validate. Very quickly, through coordination between miners and developers, everybody reverted back to 0.7. The offending block that had more than 1,024 was removed, and all of the transactions were reprocessed, but they were reprocessed under version 0.7 using the consensus rules, and the system reorganized around that chain. Later, the upgrade moved to level DB, and the 0.7 clients that couldn't handle it were upgraded so that they wouldn't choke on any block that had more than 1,024 transactions. So that's an example of where a bug caused a not a difference in the consensus rules per se, but an inability of one part of the system or one part of the network to validate a block that was otherwise valid by the consensus rules, but due to the bug could not be validated by those clients. And that caused a split. Half the network with 0.8 clients continued, half the network with 0.7 clients failed to continue, and that caused a fork. Now, you won't see any of this because the only remnants that remain in the blockchain today are the chain that was built after the reorganization. You can go back, and maybe some block explorers have kept the orphan blocks. So you'll see 26 consecutive orphan blocks during that particular period in time. These hard forks really is, if you look at a chart that shows the number of orphan blocks, you will see on average one a day, a week, blocks that are orphaned due to a perfectly natural fork that occurs when two miners discover the same block height at almost the same time. And half the network follows one chain, half the network follows the other chain, and within a block, that's reorganized. If it's more than one block, that's really, really rare. So if you look at that chart and you go back, you're going to see a few examples where that were longer than one block. You could also consider the implementation of BIP66, which was strict encoding of DER encoded signatures. I believe that was in the beginning of 2016. I'm not sure about the date exactly. But when that was activated, some miners mined a block that was interpreted with the new rules of strict DR encoding, but contained transactions that were invalid under these new rules. As a result, 6 blocks were mined that were out of compliance with the consensus rules as upgraded. And that caused the miners who followed that chain briefly to lose 6 blocks worth of reward and energy. So again, you might consider that a hard fork. It really wasn't. But these events are seen as spikes in the graph of the number of orphan blocks that occur. So you should see 1 orphan block per day, and then if you see a spike of 6, that indicated that something happened in the network, causing an extended fork. Is there any possibility that the same transactions will be picked up simultaneously by different miners and put in different blocks? Or does a transaction disappear from a pool as soon as it was taken up by some miner? What is the mechanism to solve this issue if it occurs? That's a great question, Svetlana. The important thing to recognize here is that there is no pool. There is no single memory pool. There are many memory pools. Every single node has a mempool. And it has a slightly different mempool because nodes receive transactions in different orders. So is there a possibility the same transactions will be picked up simultaneously by different miners and put in different blocks? Every miner creates a different candidate block, or at least every mining pool and every solo miner will create a different candidate block. And they will pick transactions from their own mempool, and they will sequence them in a different way, prioritizing and picking based on fees differently. And they will construct these candidate blocks and then try to mine them. When you look at the activities of different miners, they all have their own mempool. The mempool is slightly different. It might have, 1% of the transactions might be different. They may arrive in a different sequence, or they may be missing some transactions, or have some transactions that other miners don't have, because they don't propagate in the same way. Each miner has their own mempool. From that mempool, they create their own candidate block. Each miner and mining pool creates a completely different candidate block. Now, there is a possibility that two blocks may have proof of work discovered, a valid proof of work result mined simultaneously. So they become valid blocks simultaneously, or near simultaneously, within about 10 seconds of each other, where the miners will find a nonce that makes their candidate block valid by calculating a block hash that is below the target. Now, this may happen independently by two different miners in two different places, building two completely different candidate blocks with different hashes. The chance of them having the same hash is pretty much 0. It's small. But these two candidate blocks that become valid blocks will have probably 99% the same transactions, maybe not in the same order. Maybe they'll have 1 or 2 transactions extra in one block or missing in the other block. Maybe they won't be in the exact same sequence. As a result, they'll have different Merkle trees, they'll have a different Merkle root, they'll have a different block hash, and they'll have a different nonce that makes them valid. And yet, they're both valid. How does the network resolve this? A fork. That is how a natural fork occurs. A normal fork that happens on average every day and a half. 5 or 6 times a week, you'll have a fork. And this is the occasion when two candidate blocks become valid within 10 or 15 seconds of each other. They're propagated across the network. They may arrive at different locations at different speeds. And as a result, half the network thinks maybe that one of these blocks is the new valid block, and the other half gets the other one. And depending on which one arrives first, they will the second one that arrives later, but they'll put it on a minority chain, and they'll start building on the one they received first. Will then start mining. Each miner will have a perspective. They may see block A or block B as the correct parent to mine on, depending on which one they received first. And they'll start building. Now, the chances are that one of these two tips, A or B, will be extended first. As a result, once another valid block is found, and it extends either chain A or chain B, when that's propagated, it resolves the fork. If somebody builds a new block on top of chain B, then which became valid B is the winner. And its child made it the winner by extending and making that chain the longest cumulative work or greatest cumulative work. So as a result, at that point, chain B wins, and the block that the other miner found, let's call it block A, now is simply orphaned. It's still valid, and there is still a chance that there might be more blocks that make that chain longer, so it will be kept around. But most miners will continue building on block B because they will have received that as the longest chain. And as a result, that block, which is called orphaned, but it's not really orphaned. It has a parent. It doesn't have any children. Really, it should be called a childless block. That block simply sits around. All its transactions go back in the mempool unless they've already been mined in the other block, and the network reorganizes. This is the normal process for how the network decides which chain is valid. John asks, it says in the presentation that transaction hashes can be modified prior to confirmation in a block. Is this by design, or is it simply a matter of there not being a great way to stop people from modifying them? Does this create vulnerabilities or vectors for attack? Oh boy, yes, it does. John, what you're describing, the possibility of a transaction hash being modified, is called transaction malleability. It is not by design. It is really a quirk of the initial design. One of the quirks of the initial design is that the transaction hash is calculated such that it includes the signatures in the transaction hash. The problem with that signatures can be modified without invalidating the transaction. A signature signs everything in the block. Sorry, a signature signs everything in the transaction. That is, if it's a sig hash all type. It signs all the inputs, all the outputs, the values, and where the money is going. But it doesn't sign itself, because that's not possible. You can't have a signature signing itself. So as a result, the signature locks down everything else because it signed everything else. So you can't modify anything in the transaction, signature becoming invalid and transaction becoming invalid. However, you can modify the signature itself in such a way that it's still valid. Signed itself, it doesn't invalidate the transaction. And that's called transaction malleability. There are more than a dozen different ways that you can modify a signature in such a way as to still make it valid. For example, each signature includes 2 points, R and S, that are used to compute the digital signature. Each one of those has a complement, if you like, or an inverse. So there's plus R and minus R in the elliptic curve. There's also low S and high S. And those are mirrors of each other. They're symmetric, meaning that if you do a signature with low S, that is entirely equivalent to the same signature, only with high S. And also, if you do a signature with plus R, that is entirely equivalent to the same signature with minus R. Or there are other ways to malleate a signature. You can add, for example, a push value that's then dropped, an extra 0 somewhere, some kind of null potent operator. There are a number of different ways to do that. The list of all of these ways is described in a Bitcoin improvement proposal called BIP 62, if I remember correctly, which handles transaction malleability and was proposed by Peter Wool almost 2 years ago. The basic problem is this. A signature signs everything in the transaction except itself, meaning that nothing can be modified in the transaction except the signature itself. And if you can modify the signature in such a way that it is still a valid signature, that will cause the transaction hash to change. This type of transaction malleability is more accurately called third-party malleability, because it's malleability done by someone who doesn't have the keys to reapply the signatures. As the owner of the transaction, I can malleate the transaction anytime I want. It's very simple. Every time I do a signature, it uses a different random number. So every signature will be different, and every transaction ID that's produced by a different signature on the same transaction will be different. That's first-party malleability. And we're not concerned about that because I have no reason to malleate my own transactions. It would just cause me a headache. Third-party malleability is something we're worried about. If you don't have the keys, and yet you can modify the signature, for example, by replacing a low S with a high S or a plus R with a minus R value in the signature, then you don't have to have the keys to do that. And so a third party can take a transaction that's being transmitted across the network, receive it, modify it in a subtle way, such as the transaction hash changes, but the transaction is still the same, and then transmit it again on the network. And gets mined. It spends the inputs, and the other transaction will not get mined. And that's third-party transaction malleability. It causes all kinds of headaches. The first and most obvious headache is that if you count a wallet's balance by looking for transaction IDs instead of by looking at whether a UTXO has been spent or not, your software can be fooled by malleated transactions into miscounting a transaction balance, so a wallet balance. So for example, if you do a withdrawal from an exchange, and the exchange is now tracking the blockchain, looking to see if the withdrawal transaction that they signed has appeared, and checks only by transaction ID, and you modify and transmit a malleated transaction, then the transaction ID won't appear. But the withdrawal has happened because the UTXO has been spent. Now, that exchange may accidentally think that the transaction hasn't happened, and therefore issue another withdrawal and allow you to withdraw the money twice and gradually drain its wallet. This happened with Mt. Gox. And it was one of the reasons that they lost money. Not the reason that they collapsed, but it was a contributing factor. Now, knowing that transaction malleability exists, you should never depend on a transaction hash before it's confirmed. And you should always check to see if the inputs of that transaction have been spent or not. And that way you know whether a signed transaction has been submitted. No matter what this transaction hash is, if the inputs get spent, you know it's gone through. And then you can find out what its hash is. That's one vulnerability. The other one is less serious, but it's a huge headache for certain types of transactions and certain types of smart contracts. Let's say you're trying to chain together a number of transactions. So you want to make 3 transactions where the first transaction creates some amount, the second transaction spends that amount and creates another amount, and the third transaction spends that amount and creates a third amount. And those are chained together. You want to transmit them and sign them all simultaneously. But if you transmit them all and the first one is malleated, the second one is now invalid because its inputs are by reference to transaction ID that has changed. As a result, the entire chain needs to be revoked and re-signed by all of the participants in the transaction. That's a problem. If you're doing things like CoinJoin or CoinSwap, which are protocols that allow many people to come together and manage a single transaction, or you're doing some kind of Kickstarter fundraiser, where all of the inputs of a transaction are signed by many different people, multiple stages, chaining transactions together, transaction malleability can really ruin your day. More importantly, there are certain smart contracts that depend on not having transaction malleability. It makes it very difficult to make these contracts secure or efficient and convenient if transaction malleability exists. One example of that is payment channels. In a payment channel, you want to sign a funding transaction, but you only want to do that when you have in hand a delayed refund transaction that ensures that if the party you're doing the payment channel with disappears, you can still get your money back. So you never fund the channel until you have a refund. But the refund is basically refunding the funding. You have to sign those 2 transactions simultaneously. They have to be chained together. And if the funding transaction is malleated, your refund transaction is invalid. And that causes a very big problem, because then if the other party in the payment channel disappears, you lose your money. So transaction malleability is one of the things that is addressed by SegWit. Segregated witness moves the signatures out of the transaction and replaces them with empty signatures. The signature data is actually outside the transaction structure. What that means is that the transaction ID no longer depends on signatures and therefore cannot be malleated. Solution to third-party transaction malleability. And it actually makes it a lot easier to do complex smart contracts, chain transactions, and make application programming a lot easier, because you can actually depend on the transaction being immutable and unmalleable by a third party. And a question, which I think I've answered. Given that transaction malleability is fixed by segregating signature data, can one then infer that the only way to modify a transaction ID is by changing signatures? If you are not the party that created the transaction, yes. And if you do transaction malleability through a third party, the only way you can do it is by changing the signatures. If you are the party that created the transaction, then you can spend the same inputs and change the amount of change, for example, and that will change the transaction. So that's the difference between first party and third party transaction malleability. The person who signed the transaction, they can make changes. And they can make changes even if the transaction has already been transmitted to the blockchain and transmit a competing transaction. That's a double spend. It's pretty much a straightforward double spend. In the case of third-party transaction malleability, if you move the signatures out of the transaction, that fixes it completely, because it removes the underlying symptom. If a signature covers everything else in a transaction, you can't change anything in the transaction without invalidating that signature. The only thing you can change is the one thing the signature doesn't cover, which is itself. And if you can change the signature, validate it, then you can malleate the transaction. What are the realistic use cases, valid or malicious, for modifying signature data for a transaction already in the network? Really, the cases are all kind of nuisance to malicious. They can disrupt the chaining of transactions together, as I think I described in the previous answer. Vladimir asks, I made my Bitcoin paper wallet at bitaddress.org. How can I make a recovery mnemonic sequence for private key recovery? And if I import my paper wallet's address into blockchain info and start sending Bitcoins using my private key via blockchain info wallet, does blockchain info have access to my private key? Safe in that case. So Vladimir, a Bitcoin paper wallet built by bitaddress.org is not a BIP39 hierarchical deterministic wallet with multiple keys and a mnemonic backup phrase. It is a paper wallet that has a single private key, and that single private key does not have a backup mnemonic phrase. The paper wallet is the backup. If you want to do a recovery mnemonic sequence, you need to use an HD wallet, and you can generate those offline, and you can also generate those with a website. There are a number of BIP39 generators, and I'll find one and post it to the web page here so that you can try it as part of my answer. To your second part of your question, if you import your paper wallet address into blockchain info and start sending Bitcoins with your private key, well, it's not a paper wallet anymore. You've put it online. If you import your private key into anything, you've put it online. You've shown it to a camera with a QR code. You've typed it into a keyboard. You've put it on a system. And if that system is online, which in the case of blockchain info it is, there's a very good chance that when you imported that, if your computer has been compromised, your private key has been compromised. That defeats the entire purpose. You should only ever import a paper wallet in order to spend it completely. For example, to send it to another paper wallet and use it in a wallet. That's no longer a secure mechanism. You could still consider the paper wallet a backup, but the problem is that many wallets, once they import a private key, will send the change to a different address. So you're not really having a backup either. You've backed up one private key, but your funds have been moved to a change address, which is somewhere else, which is why you should never spend incrementally from a paper wallet. In case the change goes somewhere else, you should always sweep it, move all of the money, and then not use it again. In general, I would say that paper wallets are not as secure as a BIP39 mnemonic backup phrase. You can achieve very much the same backup and recovery mechanism and cold storage mechanism that you would do with a paper wallet by generating a BIP39 compliance seed offline. And you can use a web-based generator like bitaddress.org to do that. Not bitaddress.org itself, but others. And you can generate these hierarchical deterministic wallets offline. You could save the recovery phrase, write it down on paper, and keep that as a backup. And then you can, online, use the XPub to generate receive addresses and public keys that you can use in a variety of different ways to receive money. But you can also then import this mnemonic phrase into a hardware wallet, or you can simply store it offline in cold storage on paper. Achieves the same thing as a paper wallet, much more versatile, and compatible with a variety of wallets. So I would recommend, if you're trying to do this for cold storage, use a BIP39 mnemonic instead. One of the sites that does this is called Coinbin, COINB.in, coinb.in. Coinbin is a JavaScript website that loads entirely client-side that you can save as an HTML page, take it offline on a USB stick or something like that, load it on an air-gapped, secured offline machine, and generate HD wallets to your heart's content. You can generate multi-sig keys, you can generate private keys, you can do all kinds of things like that, including creating a backup recovery mnemonic sequence and saving it on paper. Nicola asks, can we get more information about Bitcoin network elections, i.e. making consensus changes between the nodes? Can any member propose a question to which the whole network will make a decision? Does consensus mean that all the nodes should agree upon something, or just a majority, 51%? Is there a day per week, month, in which voting occurs or not? Nicola, voting really isn't the right concept here, and I think that's a common misconception. Many of us have misused the word voting, I think, and that's our mistake. I think it's better to talk instead about signaling intent, and we'll talk about that more specifically. So there are ways to make changes to consensus rules. Depending on how these changes are made, they may be backwards compatible or not. Backwards compatible are called soft forks because they don't require everyone to upgrade. Anyone who doesn't upgrade can still remain within consensus to the network. Changes that are not backwards compatible are called hard forks because they require everyone to upgrade. And if you do not upgrade, you are essentially no longer in consensus, and you will be unable to follow the consensus change. These changes are introduced by changes in the software that is run by nodes. And this includes both users, nodes run by merchants, exchanges, payment processing hubs, and the entire ecosystem of companies that run Bitcoin nodes, as well as miners. So all of the different constituencies that are involved in the consensus mechanism of Bitcoin, again, wallets, exchanges, merchants, developers, and miners have input into the consensus rules. The developers write the rules in their software. Users choose which software to run for their personal wallets, or they choose by picking one of the wallets that is out there, perhaps a web-based wallet, a smart wallet, a smartphone wallet, a client-side wallet, or a custodial wallet. They choose by picking exchanges. They choose by picking merchants. And merchants choose which software to run, and exchanges choose which software to run, and wallet companies choose which software to run on their nodes. As a result, these nodes together decide what is a valid transaction and what is a valid block. If all of the nodes assume that only certain transactions are valid, then those are the only transactions that get to miners, and those are the only transactions that miners can sequence and put into a block. If the nodes change what they consider valid and they send different transactions, and the miners don't consider them valid, they will not include them in blocks. So you can't really make changes where only the nodes change or where only the miners change, unless those changes are are backwards compatible. Usually that means restricting the rules. So that means something that was valid before is no longer valid according to the new rules. And by restricting the rules, it's not a problem for non-upgraded software because they still see these transactions as valid, even if you don't. That means they simply don't get propagated across the network if all of the nodes decide these transactions are no longer valid, and they don't reach miners. So an example of that would be segregated witness. Segregated witness is a soft fork. As a result, a node that looks at a segregated witness transaction will consider it valid even if it doesn't know what a segregated witness transaction is. And as a result, it will propagate it across the network. And miners will see it as valid also and mine it. So it's really is a backwards compatible change. By comparison, a change that changes the block size limit is not backwards compatible. If the consensus rules running on some nodes say now you can do 2 megabyte blocks, and one of the miners mines a 2 megabyte block, nodes that have not changed their consensus rules will not see that as valid, will not propagate it, and will find themselves on a different chain. And at that point, you have a hard fork. You have two chains emerging, one which allows 2 megabyte blocks, one which doesn't by the old rules. And as a result, you have that discrepancy. To avoid problems where there isn't agreement between everyone as to what the consensus rule should be, the developers of Bitcoin Core have implemented a signaling mechanism called BIP9. BIP9 allows specific features to be proposed, and that usually means proposed by the developers, specifically the developers writing Bitcoin Core, which is a pretty big group of developers. These changes then get introduced as BIP9 proposals. They have a specific start date for their voting, and an end date, which is usually 1 year. So, for example, segregated witness is one such proposal. The previous proposal that was also passed by those rules is check sequence verify, or CSV. They have a start date and an end date, and during that time, they must achieve a threshold of 95% on blocks, meaning that miners who want to implement this and signal that they will support this signal that by mining a specific header version in their block. The block version is a bit field that indicates support for this specific feature. If more than 95% of the blocks mined in a specific difficulty retarget period of 2016 blocks exceeds 95%, then that feature is activated. And it has 1 year to do that. To achieve that 95% threshold. Once it's activated forever. That's it. There is no going back once it's activated. And it can happen anytime during the 1 year period when this signaling period starts. So, for example, segregated witness started its signaling period on November 15th of 2016. It has until November 15th of 2017 for more than 95% of blocks in a specific retargeting period to signal approval of SegWit. However, this isn't the only way that changes get made. In a sense, there isn't an election. And the reason there isn't an election is because you can't address all of the constituencies that need to be working together. There's no way to collect the votes of exchanges and merchants and wallets and users. Measured using indirect ways of looking at how many people are upgrading their nodes, for example, how many companies that build wallets and exchanges are supportive of a new change. And then the miners may have the ability to signal for the final approval, if you like. But they're only one part of the constituency of consensus. There are some cases where some of these groups may decide to try to push through a change without the other members of the consensus, so without the other constituencies of consensus. Miners can push through a change with 51%, but to do so, they have to force a hard fork on the network, and they have to hope that exchanges, wallets, users, and merchants follow them. Otherwise, they're mining a chain that they can't sell the Bitcoins from, because no exchange will buy them. And they can't spend because no merchant will receive them. And they can't use any of the wallets because none of the wallets recognize them. So there is a risk of doing a 51% fork without the economic majority approving of that change. That would really be considered an attack against the network. There are also possibilities for the opposite occurring, where the economic majority of the network, specifically merchants, exchanges, wallets, and users, running nodes that have a different set of consensus rules than the miners, and approving transactions or disapproving transactions and not routing them to miners. That's been described recently as a user-activated soft fork, but it's essentially a change in the consensus rules that starts with the nodes. We've seen that happen before. It's in fact how the pay-to-script hash BIP16 feature was activated. Now, in that particular case, the miners were fully on board, so there was no contention. And you can have contentious forks with user-activated soft forks, just like you can have contentious forks with miner-activated hard forks. There really is no straightforward way to do elections on Bitcoin. And the primary reason for that is that the only way you can't fake a vote is if you put hashing power behind it. If we do an election that only involves miners, that only represents a small part of the constituencies of consensus. But there's no real way to measure how many merchants, exchanges, users, and wallets and developers are supportive of a specific change, because you can fake those numbers. Let's say, for example, that you count how many nodes. Well, I can set up 1,000 virtual machines, run 1,000 nodes for a month, and make it look like thousands and thousands of nodes support a specific version of the software. But it's really just me willing to spend $10,000 or $15,000 a month to run all of these fake nodes. And that's happened a few times in the past. That's called a Sybil attack. A Sybil attack is when nodes pretend to be real, and in fact, they're all just controlled by a single user, sock puppets, effectively, of a single person. Now, the only solution we have to Sybil attacks so far is proof of work. And proof of work is one of the ways that we resolve these questions. Again, proof of work is something you can only do if you have mining gear. And that creates the problem, again, that only one of the constituencies of consensus gets to vote with mining gear. As a result, because this election problem is difficult to solve, is why we are at the current deadlock. Those who want SegWit to activate, and those who want an increase in the block size with a hard fork. Scott asks, there is a strong use case for digital micropayments on the internet, but due to the current level of transaction fees on the Bitcoin network, micropayments carry a high overhead. Is there a possibility of making Bitcoin micropayments less expensive again? That's a thorny question. Yes, there is a possibility of making Bitcoin micropayments less expensive again. There are really 2 or 3 different ways of doing that. One way to see Bitcoin micropayments being less expensive is when they happen off-chain between privately managed databases. So for example, if you want to send a payment from one Coinbase user to another Coinbase user, and that payment doesn't go on the Bitcoin blockchain network, but instead is handled entirely within Coinbase, or from Coinbase to a merchant that's also used as a Coinbase account, or any exchange or any merchant processing system, if the transaction happens internally within their own systems, it's not put on the blockchain, and therefore it has no fees. And on that platform, you can do micropayments. The problem with that is that you can only do that if you trust that provider. So it creates a trusted third party. That's the reality of what's happening today. Transactions that are too expensive to do on the Bitcoin network are being pushed onto private networks owned by private companies, where you have to trust these private companies entirely with these funds. And that's a pretty big risk. An alternative is to increase the capacity of the Bitcoin network through an increase in the block size limit. That's generally considered a temporary fix, because it is likely that demand will outstrip supply pretty soon, and fees will go up again. Finally, a third option, which it seems quite promising, and I'm very interested in myself, is the use of payment channels and routed payment channels in the form of Lightning Network, or alternatives like, for example, T-Chain or Tumblebit, Hub, which are some alternative implementations of payment channels. Routed payment channels, whether Lightning Network or another implementation, basically allow you to have a second layer of transactions. But unlike a private database on a private exchange where you have to trust someone, you don't have to trust anyone. These are trustless. They're user to user. Everyone can run a node, and they can do direct micropayments by connecting several of these channels together without trusting any of the intermediary hops. These payment channels also create very high levels of privacy, flexibility, and low cost. So I do think we're going to see Bitcoin micropayments be less expensive again. And I think probably the best chance we have for that is something like Lightning Network, which shows a lot of promise, and in tests is I'm running it in a test network at the moment, and it is quite promising. In order for that to happen, however, it requires activation of segregated witness in order to resolve transaction malleability. While most of these things, Tumblebit, T-Chain, and Lightning Network can operate without SegWit, in some cases, it becomes much more cumbersome and complicated to operate them without a fixed transaction malleability. Aaron asks, given that Bitcoin Unlimited has overtaken SegWit, a hard fork looks more likely than ever. If and when we do hard fork, how do I access my coins on the new chain? Will I have to get a new Bitcoin Unlimited wallet? Also, will we have to wait for the exchanges to start accepting the new Bitcoin Unlimited coins? And who gets to call themselves Bitcoin, the bigger chain or the smaller chain? Aaron, that's a pretty loaded question. We really don't have too many answers to that. While Bitcoin Unlimited has overtaken SegWit in terms of signaling intent, I don't think that a hard fork looks more likely than ever. I'm honestly quite skeptical about the possibility of a hard fork. It is an extremely risky maneuver that has a very big chance of backfiring badly, both for any miners that attempt to do it, split in the network, and do massive damage to Bitcoin, to Bitcoin's brand, to Bitcoin's price, and to the operation of the network. A hard fork without resolving political issues, as well as without resolving technical issues, like the ability to replay transactions from one fork on the other fork, would be extremely damaging. There is a possibility. So if and when we do hard fork, how do you access your coins on the new chain? Will you have to get a new Bitcoin Unlimited wallet? If you control your keys, then those keys work on both chains. Now, in order to make sure that you're doing transactions on one chain versus the other, you will need a wallet that can choose which chain it operates on. You will also need to consider whether, if you make a transaction can be replayed, not by you, but by someone else, onto the other chain. We saw that during the Ethereum hard fork. So let's say you tried to spend your Bitcoin Unlimited coins and buy a Ferrari because you have a lot of BU coins. Fantastic. So you open your wallet, you make a transaction on the Bitcoin Limited fork that spends your Bitcoin Unlimited coins. Unfortunately, that transaction is also valid on the other fork. As a result, the Ferrari dealer might get two transactions, paying the amount you wanted to pay in Bitcoin Unlimited coins, and because your transaction was replayed, also spending the same amount in to the merchant. So as a result, you've now sent the same transaction twice, once on each fork, and that can cause some headaches. Transaction replay is not an easy thing to fix, and it's one of the big risks of a fork. Your next part of the question was, will we have to wait for the exchanges to start accepting the new BU coins? Yes, you will. And again, you have a problem with transaction replay. If you want to sell coins from one of the two forks, first you need an exchange that will list the coins separately for the two forks. And then you would have to have a way to the exchange. But if you simply sign a transaction to the receive address, even if you do it with a wallet that understands the difference between the two forks, that transaction, again, can be replayed on the other fork, and then you send the money twice on both forks to the exchange. And then, again, you have a mess. In the past, we saw during the Ethereum fork, some exchanges actually lost quite a bit of money by replay transactions that spent their Ethereum Classic, for example, every time a user did a withdrawal on Ethereum. Who gets to call themselves Bitcoin, the bigger chain or the smaller chain? Well, this is where we get all of the damage to the brand. You see, the problem, Aaron, is that both chains will call themselves Bitcoin. They will both call themselves the true original vision of Satoshi Nakamoto the Great. And there will be no way to explain this to new users. It will cause enormous frustration and confusion with new users. It will dilute the brand. It will cause problems as to which coin is the real coin and which isn't. It's hard enough to explain Bitcoin as it is. It will also cause problems with the fact that there are now not 21 million coins, but 42. One of one kind and 21 of the other that will be mined. So I think, Aaron, the questions you've asked point exactly to why a contentious hard fork that splits Bitcoin into two coins would be an unmitigated disaster for Bitcoin. Maybe Bitcoin will survive it. Maybe one of the two Bitcoins will survive it. Maybe it will be a clear split. I don't think it will, and I'm not willing to take that kind of risk. So if I had any say in this matter, I would certainly not want to see this kind of fork occur. Any say in this matter. So we'll see how it goes. Andreas asks, what is the value of minimum difficulty? How does difficulty work? How is the network hash rate calculated? Average, max, total? Are Bitcoin Unlimited and Bitcoin Classic mining rigs backwards compatible? Do they mine normal Bitcoins, or what do they mine? What is the equivalent command of get generate on OS X? OK, let's answer each one of these. So I'll take them very separately. What is the value of minimum difficulty? How does difficulty work? The value of minimum difficulty is 1. The difficulty metric is the ratio of how difficult it is to mine a coin now versus how difficult it was in the very first blocks. The very first blocks had a difficulty of 1. If you had today a difficulty of 10, that means it takes 10 times the hashing power to mine the same block as it did when the difficulty was 1. And in fact, today it's some quintillion times more difficult, if I remember correctly. So difficulty is that. How many times more difficult is it? How much more hash power is required today to mine the same block? The original one, which was a difficulty of 1. How is the network hash rate calculated? Average, max, or total? It's calculated based on average, and that's a statistical approximation based on the proof of work. The proof of work itself is a probabilistic measure. The chances of finding a nonce that will produce a specific amount as the block hash, which is below the target, that is a certain statistical probability that you will be able to do that. And that probability tells you how many hashes on average you need to do in order to find one. Averaging that over a few blocks gives you the average hash rate. So the hash rate of the network is an average. It's probably a rolling average over several blocks to smooth out some of the details, some of the fluctuations. Are Bitcoin Unlimited and Bitcoin Classic mining rigs backwards compatible? Do they mine coins, or what do they mine? The mining rigs are exactly the same. Nothing changes with mining. Itself is trying to find SHA-256 hashes on a block header. The block header is the same. Nothing changes in the mining hardware. What changes is in the software nodes that are building blocks. And these, in the case of Bitcoin Classic or Bitcoin Unlimited, will build blocks. If they are attempting to do a hard fork, will build blocks that are greater than 1 megabyte. And that's the difference. That's really the only difference. The moment one of these nodes builds a block that's greater than 1 megabyte and other miners start building on top of it, you have a hard fork. What is the equivalent command to get generate on OS X? I don't know. Sorry, I'll have to answer that one offline. Henk van Kaan asks, reading the sections on mining using ASICs, I was wondering how feasible it would be to create ASICs to just generate as many public-private key pairs as possible that are gradually exhausting the number of available public addresses. This would be a scenario like that. Henk, Generating public-private key pairs involves more than hashing. It involves, first, an elliptic curve multiplication function, which is several orders of magnitude slower than a hashing function. After the elliptical curve multiplication, in order to produce a Bitcoin address, you also need to do hashing with 2 different hashing algorithms. You can put this in an ASIC, and if you did, maybe you can generate thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of keys per second. If you did that with a lot of ASICs generating millions of keys per second, you would not achieve anything. You would be able to do some of the work, but the key space itself is enormous. You're looking at just under 2 to the 256 key space, and that is an enormous amount of work. Even if you were doing billions and billions of keys per second on billions of machines, it would take billions and billions of years, and you would use billions of gigawatts of energy to do it. So you would make no impact on cryptocurrencies or on the available key space. And that's all the time we have. Let's see. Very quick question there. If a hard fork occurs, what is your advice for those saving Bitcoin in hardware wallets? How will the hard fork affect Bitcoin demand? So if you have keys on a hardware wallet, or if you have keys on a paper wallet, or if you have keys on another wallet, keys are just numbers. Those numbers unlock Bitcoin. If they unlock Bitcoin on a chain today, they will unlock Bitcoin on 2 chains after a fork. At that point, my best advice is sit tight and wait until you have a clear idea of where the fork is going. Do not rush to try to spend, sell, liquidate, whatever. The problem is that because of transaction replay, any transactions you make may end up happening on both chains. You may inadvertently spend the other chain when you meant to only spend one chain, and that can cause problems. Of course, the problem is that while you are holding things to settle down, the Bitcoin price may go through enormous volatility. It may crash badly, and you may be tempted to try to save some of your Bitcoin by selling it to preserve that value. If that is the case, you have invested more money in Bitcoin than you should have invested, and it might be a good idea to not hold that much Bitcoin in the first place. If you're worried that a collapse in the Bitcoin price would cause serious damage to your finances, you are overextended in your Bitcoin investments, and you should reconsider that. But otherwise, if you have invested prudently and the amount of Bitcoin you have would not cause you a hardship, the best thing you can do if you have keys on both chains is to not do anything for a while until things sort themselves out. At the end of it, you'll probably have Bitcoin on 2 chains, and that Bitcoin will probably be worth less than half of what Bitcoin was worth in the beginning, while the aggregate price, the sum of the 2 Bitcoins might be the same. The damage done to the brand, the network effect, the network, the goodwill of everybody involved due to these political games would be significant, and we would see a significant loss in value, in my opinion. We saw that happening with Ethereum. Just before the fork, Ethereum was at almost $20, and after the fork, it dropped all the way down to about 8. And it remained there for more than a year, set back Ethereum for more than a year. Now it's rebounded, but it did a lot of damage. That fork probably cost Ethereum more than $1 billion. In Bitcoin's case, it would probably be significantly bigger damage if a fork were to occur. That optimistic end, I would like to repeat that actually I don't think we're going to see a fork. I don't think the economic incentives would be sensible for miners to do. an aggressive fork against the interests of the rest of the Bitcoin community. I would be surprised if it happened, not pleasantly surprised, and I hope it won't. With that, let's wrap it up. This is session 5 of the massive open online course for the master's degree in digital currencies at the University of Nicosia. I've been your host, Andreas. It's been my pleasure to answer your questions, and I will see you at the next session. Don't forget, more questions on the forums, more questions in the chat rooms. Do your homework, read up on the next section, and I will be happy to answer your next questions next week. Thank you.